Hello everyone. Today I didn't have the time to prepare anything meaningful because I was out the whole day. So if you don't mind, really, I came up with this idea of talking a little bit about thesis, university thesis, and how essentially you can deal with this. And I think it's an important topic because I don't know, when I went through university, I naturally had people in my family who had written thesis, but it was either in other subjects from mine, or I didn't have, even I'm an only son, so I didn't have this kind of a direct, immediate experience of it. My parents, studied when I was, I was very far from being even thought. So I objectively have to deal with this really on my own. And the most astonishing thing I think broadly, and this is also just a part of a broader problem, is that I really didn't have any meaningful help before going to university, nor really going to school. I mean, there were certain essentials that were right to me. I had to behave, I have to study. I've always been kind of a good student, so I never had particular problems. But I realized that it is and it is perfectly normal that things have really to be learned by yourself. I mean, direct experience is probably the most important one. It's the one you can't really do without, and a great part of the process of growing up, becoming mature, responsible, is definitely on your head. But at the same time, I think education is extremely important. It's actually probably the most important thing of our age at this point. And this is not just an anecdotal, idealistic or romantic ideal. I mean, I truly believe from a sheer pragmatic point of view that it starts all from education at this point, and we have to reform it in some way. Not radically. I'm not one of those people who wants to change the essentials. On the contrary, I like very much the traditional models of teaching that have been really too and uselessly criticized in many ways. And I think that the real problem is really now that the fabric of society is really changing in many ways. So it's not really about the methods, it's really about the discipline, the ability of teaching well, and really delivering a knowledge that is not just, in fact, anecdotal. It's not just simple, notion at a notionalistical level, but has to help the student develop. And this is a huge problem, really, that we can't talk about in today's video, but I will definitely comment at a point. And definitely one of the probably the most meaningful experiences, the most significant experiences I had during my education were the thesis that I had to write. I'm currently writing one of it, because I wrote my bachelor thesis, my master thesis, and now I'm writing essentially in this 3 years long journey my PhD thesis. And it's been really, these have been really the defining moments of my education recently, because writing this thesis has really given so much to me and has made me understand, for reasons that I will try to explain today, that knowledge is really something that has to be focused on, has to be conceived and explained, and we must essentially say how it is like. Before going to university, I also met, this was a common experience among my peers, my classmates, my colleagues and friends and so on of my age. The problem that you have many ideas about the future, how university is, what your job is going to be like, and life in general, but you don't quite really know how it's going to be. I mean, even in school, there is always this kind of wondering and mumbling together with your classmates what's it's going to be like the next test, or what this new teacher is about, how it's the final test in the end. So life is actually an endless series of exams. You can interpret it in this way. I like very much this. In life, exams never end, and it has nothing to do with just with school or university. Life it's a very difficult experience, a very challenging one, and that's why I believe we should talk about certain dynamics. Today, I also wanted to throw other things in, but I will stick to this now about, I don't know, how you manage anxiety during your studies. That it's seemingly an ever-growing problem at this point. Why you should choose to study or not. On Schwerpunkt, I already said something about history degrees and other and reds and so on. So today I think I will concentrate on thesis because they are probably they are usually for the average person the only chance you have in life to write something that is truly your own. I mean, in a scholastic or university career, where most of the things you do is essentially learning from someone else on texts written by someone else, with a thesis, you basically have the opportunity to write something that really comes, from within your interests, your mind, and that is truly yours as an intellectual product. And so it's also a very good chance not to waste. As I'm sure most of that I've seen dramatic, read dramatic statistics on how much students copy thesis, especially obviously the bachelor ones, that in most of the countries at this point have become seriously just a joke. Let's be honest about it. But I would argue that secondary education in many ways is really falling in quality. I mean, it's not really that it's not maybe designed effectively for the society that is developing in this point. It's just that the way also universities and school teach at this point, and the process of selection and teaching and educating it's really decaying in some way. And I know it's kind of a old person view. The other things get worse. Actually, I'm positive overall. I mean, I think that also these institutions have the ability, and also the teachers that work in them, mostly they're qualified people, have the ability to transform this world. I mean, I finished school like a bit less than 10 years ago, and I realized by talking with people very younger, my family, other people, that things have kind of already changed. So it's as if I felt myself old at this point to say, in my times school was different. But objectively, I'm not kidding, there has been a generational, at this point the world is changing very rapidly, and different differences between generations sometimes can be strikingly evident, and especially in this fields of education, of the process of learning. I am probably, like, by the way, probably also most of my followers, probably a very unique generation in history that has been raised substantially with paper and pencil, and eventually transitioned into into the digital era, in their teenage and so on. And we kind of have both of the side of the story. This gives us probably a great edge in many ways. I mean, we have a bit of both of the worlds that came before and afterwards, and this is very important because it's as if we knew the value of both things. And naturally, in the future now, probably much, there will be other major changes, so this will intersect also with other dynamics. We are already old in many ways at this point. That's why I was commenting in that fashion. But so there are so many questions that can be posed about education. I think this is very important, and this is why in Schwerpunkt every once in a while we'll try to talk about this. And I'm aware also that there are people who are well into their their adulthood, that they are mature people that maybe have not gone to university. They've never written a thesis, and they maybe would like. When I went to university, I found many people who were in their 30s, 40s, 50s, 60s. Some were the generations of my parents. Actually, they were maybe professionists, people who had were doctors, engineers, and so on. And one day they decided at that age to take a bachelor degree in history. Why not? I mean, for many people, history is definitely fascinating. Many people are interested into it, and I would say studying is useful at every age. Obviously, it's better if you do it when you're younger, because your mind is fresher, your brain absorbs more information, it gets shaped while it's still in its the most vital thing. already, if you're in the second half of your 20s, you're already kind of old for certain things, but objectively you can learn all throughout all your life, and there are also some objective limits that younger people have that eventually, but it's also really a matter of mind shaping, and this is what I would like to stress also in this video on thesis, because what the thesis is, to make a long story short, it's essentially a text that you have to write to prove to your people who are going to evaluate you eventually, your university, that not only you've been able to to give all those exams, so repeating essentially learning what you have found on other books, but that you're also able to read books, academic texts, sources, and basically combining this knowledge and formulating something new, essentially an original synthesis that is hopefully on a topic that maybe is not being looked at still in its in all its of its aspects. So originality is also important, and this is a bit this is, I think, an important part of the story, but it's not excessively important. It really depends. It has to be new for you essentially, and then that's perhaps the most important thing. And that's pretty much it. Many people say, well, if I write a good thesis, this is what usually the younger also believe. If I write a thesis that is particularly good, my career will be better. But it's not really like that. I mean, honestly, at this point, at least, whatever you write in your bachelor thesis is going to be completely meaningless for your curriculum. The master thesis can be, sometimes you find even in kind of professor's curricula, this, I don't know, this guy wrote the master thesis in, but I rarely find it today, and it's not that I read many curricula, to tell the truth, I don't give a damn about it. I'm very iconoclastic on certain things, so perhaps today's video should also be taken with a pinch of salt. But the master thesis is already something more consistent. It really depends. There are brilliant master theses, there are others that are really rubbish. So yeah, probably quality helps, but it's mostly you helping yourself. I mean, there is a sort of path that if you're going to go on with your university and academic career eventually, is kind of useful for you, and this is kind of self-evident, but we will get it to it more precisely in one moment. Then what really matters, honestly, is your PhD thesis. If especially you want to prosecute in your academic career, the PhDs even today are becoming, for certain reasons that we don't have the time to discuss now, not really a joke, because also in here people copy. I don't remember where was one of German ministers recently that was found out that she had copied everything via her PhD thesis, stuff like that. So unfortunately, certain practices are pretty much widespread, and especially in the age of the digital information, you can't really, it doesn't really take much to make paste and copy. That's a very great temptation. So it seems like, I think before it was really worse, also because the fact that theses were not digitalized also made it more difficult to see whether you had copied them or not. Today there are actually very sophisticated softwares that can tell you, by just inserting the text of the thesis into them, whether there is a, if there is something published out there in this major data banking of thesis, or simply the internet as a whole, that whether if you have copied parts of the text and so on. And there is also a big parenthesis we should open on the concept of copying. What is really intellectual property, how objectively it's very difficult sometimes. There is a very middle ground, very gray area that sometimes it's very difficult to tell, because from a strictly legal point of view, basically literally everything that you take from someone else should be quoted, even if it's re-elaborated. And there is always someone who theoretically can tell you have copied this from me, or you got this idea from me, you didn't quote me, and so on. And this is something that I personally never been into, because firstly I've never actually copied from other texts, but I did draw some information that I didn't really um, was claiming to be mine, but that maybe I didn't quote because it was just the reformulation of an idea I had heard elsewhere. So at that point, what's the there are even certain phrases that are in my mind that I've heard somewhere or that maybe I've read from an internet site and so on that remain in my mind and that I use or rephrase in a certain fashion. So at that point, what's really the intellectual property? It's very complicated to say, and then I had never anyone who came to me and said, you've stolen this thing. And usually, I've always been glad to quote anyone I was taking the ideas from, but we all learn from other people. So there's a limit in practice where also from a strictly legal point of view, you can't really assess certain things. But this is not perhaps very important. But just for saying, because I know it's an extremely, unfortunate, sadly, very widespread practice. But at that point, I think it's not that the damage is bad, because I think that if you get to there are many people who find out that their material is being stolen, especially theses are very much like this, and that must be devastating because in fact it's something that is truly your own, that is being used by someone else without quoting and maybe copying even the mistakes and with all of that. It happens, sadly. But so all the people who do this usually are not gonna go far, because if you copy a thesis, you're essentially just a loser, because you admittedly you admit this practically that you're not able to do so, or that you're such a scum that you need to really skip the work and just essentially steal, and it's a seriously legal thing to do what these people do. And I know maybe on Schwerpunkt sometimes I upload pictures that are not mine, but when you find them so widespread on the internet, they're used everywhere. Yeah, the author can always come and claim, but really it's not going to be so often that the person makes a legal action against you, unless it's just not something so clamorous for which you're really saying, this is mine, and it's all about me, and you're basically even making a fortune propagating your own the intellectual property of something you don't have, basically. But this is really, I entered in this field, and I don't know why I did, but this is still kind of important to remember, because after all, it's a problem you immediately face when you're writing a thesis, because the temptation really to say, okay, let's do paste and copy is very high, especially when you have the blank paper in front of you, you don't know how to start, you've never done this, and many people work like that. And perhaps it's even fair to do paste and copy if you really have a crisis of blank paper crisis, and then to rephrase, to reformulate, and to quote the source. It's perfectly fine, and usually this happens in bachelor thesis all the time. It's not really a big deal, and everybody knows basically the students copy in that fashion. As long as you quote where you found the information, as long as it's not a literal copy, it's really fine. There's nothing going wrong. The real problem is, thinking your thesis and what it is and how you should work for it. The thesis, really, this depends on your goal, on your objectives. I mean, there are people who stop to the bachelor one, others will go on with a master and PhD and so on. And in the meanwhile, naturally, even at university, I mean, during classes, it happens all the time. You're writing small theses for an exam. There were certain exams that were thesis. In my case, it's perfectly fine. I come from a context where we're more orally and rhetorically oriented towards in exams and so on. But even writing is an extremely useful exercise for itself, and this is probably the most important thing after all. And that's the reason why you have to produce a thesis. A written thesis, and to eventually just discuss it, because really the process of writing is very important. It's something that is also being lost objectively, the ability of writing, of formulating a new concept, of making a synthesis of the information you have and to turn it into a new idea and being able to express it. It's a very beautiful intellectual process, and this is being lost because everything is becoming much quicker, much faster, and people don't like to stop focusing anymore. Sometimes they even can't. objectively, but this makes the quality of work kind of declining. Albeit I must say that um, mm, I don't want to say everything is crumbling. That there are in the essentials, perhaps this field has maybe even improved, thanks also to digitalization and naturally allowed people to access many more sources at once. While in the past you had to go to the library, you have to take it. Unfortunately, I've never been, I've never been living into that. I've been obviously photographing even lots of books and so on, but most of the sources I've used mostly either were already digitalized or maybe they were easily accessible as in other ways. So this is not really the problem. Unfortunately, this is gonna improve soon. So we still have a huge amount of material online that is accessible to anyone for free. So the important is the goal. When you get to the bachelor thesis, obviously there are many people who essentially just take a bachelor thesis and finish their studies. They go out there for a job. So at this point, the bachelor thesis is really just a formality, in my opinion. You shouldn't be so extremely focused on it. It took for me, my bachelor thesis took me 3 years. Excuse me, not 3 years, 3 months, fortunately, which is already a lot. My bachelor thesis, obviously, 3 months, which is a lot. It was 160 pages long, and it was actually fine. Sometimes I go rereading it and say, well, it wasn't really so bad. And I was personally very interested in the topic, and I wanted to take also a bit of time for myself after those 3 years of studying, and I think I did well, because actually I lost 1 year for doing this because I had the possibility of writing a much shorter thing. Usually bachelor theses are much smaller than that. They can be even, I don't know, I've met people who have written 30 pages. That's ridiculous in my opinion, but there are people who do like that. It naturally depends, because in 30 pages you can write some of the most sophisticated concepts ever heard. You can quote extensive amount of bibliographical material and so on. But I like always to do big stuff to engage into this kind of even irrealistic enterprises. But it'll make me spend a lot of time. And maybe the quality suffers eventually, because these works are, when they're too big, then eventually they tend to lack in quality. But it's not really like that, and that's why it took me so much time to write that, 3 months. And it was fine for that, because as I said before, this is a unique chance you have. So to just write those 30 pages because you have to do it as a formality, yeah, okay, you do, but there's nothing really wrong in stopping a moment, saying, okay, maybe I want to really deepen a topic that in these 3 years of university I've been missing, and that I want to look better at, to learn. And it was my case, because I think at the time I think I hadn't studied the topic of my, not even in a broad sense as a subject, so I concentrated something. It was about military history, by the way, so it was always very narrowly. I had also this point that we'll get to, that I had basically no one helping me directly, because in my department we don't have any military historian teaching there, so I had to do most of the thing on my own. But hey, that was simple. That was really simple, and in fact it was sadly kind of mostly of a bibliographical thesis. I mean, it was mostly based on studies, not on the sources. I mean, sometimes the sources were out there, but I thought it was quicker and even better to consult a study, because that person maybe was just an authority on the topic and had already figured out many things before. So proceeding just with one source at once, it would have taken me more time, and when most of the knowledge is already there. This is very important to point out, because from one side it's the eternal struggle between source and bibliography and historiography, essentially, because did I say bibliographical thesis? Well, I meant mostly historiographical thesis, but the point I was making is, studying on the sources is beautiful. I think historically speaking, it's the most beautiful thing you can ever do. But objectively, it does take a lot of time, and you can't pretend from a person that has started university only from 3 years to be able to write so much, in fact, around this, using only certain sources and not acknowledging the importance of historiography and how many other people studied this thing before. So I think the bachelor thesis is a very good chance to maybe, yeah, already surely give a look at the primary sources that are the base, the cornerstone of every historical research, but already, if there is already an extensive amount of bibliography on the topic, maybe it's better if you read that. I mean, it's gonna open your mind probably more on the topic in general than the source in itself. That can, that is naturally coupled most of the times with other information coming from, if you want to, my bachelor thesis was about early medieval times. So at that point, I had necessarily, I am a historian. I don't understand much about archaeology. I had to read studies from archaeologists, because what do I know about archaeological sources, right? So in that case, that's evident. But already coupling the two things at once, since the bachelor thesis is very important, and I would say that even if so few is requested in the end to get that degree through this work, it's still worth the pain to go to look a bit in depth into it. So where do you get the sources? Where do you get the studies? Well, the most intelligent thing to do, well, it's hopefully, if you're arrived at the end of your degree, it we already assumed that you know what sources and historiography is substantially, and about how to handle a bibliography and how to look into it. So you tendentially also in here it really depends what your path has been, because at that point it's not really just a matter of, I mean, in 3 years you can't understand many things still when you start studying history, but so it happens that maybe if you're interested in one topic that you have never studied before, I mean, at university proper, or that you don't have a great passion, historical passion for yourself, for which you have already read something about it on your own, it's better really to ask your professor, which is what you are supposed to do in the first place, because you can't write a thesis without a tutor, basically. So this person is gonna be, obviously you have to look for someone who knows the craft, and knows the topic better. Hopefully the craft of the historian, but in general, was acquainted to the sources. So in my case, I didn't, because as I said before, I didn't have any specialists at that point that could, I mean, theoretically I could have remained in contact with other people who were not in my university and so on, but it is not really necessary at that point, in my opinion. That's something you should mostly look for if you're perhaps in your master thesis, and your PhD definitely, which I also didn't do, and I'm traveling really on my own, and this is kind of wild, but this is just me. Most of the people really look for someone who helps, and that's important, because at that point of your university path, there is you still don't know much, and there is always your professors are usually people who are better educated than you on that field, especially if they're specialists, obviously. Sometimes the thing can't really be parity. I had, for instance, during my bachelor thesis, I was writing my topic with a professor who is definitely, perhaps, I consider her to be actually the greatest expert of that topic I wrote the thesis on. I mean, not specifically, the thesis was not military history, but the general context. As most of you already know, that was about the Longobards, and therefore my professor knew basically everything about the Longobards, but about the military point of view, at least from a broadly, obviously she knows so much about politics and society and so on, but she, by her own admission, she never looked thoroughly into this strictly military thing, although in that context, it's not that there is not even so much to know. In fact, what she told me, this topic is quite good for a bachelor thesis, but if you had asked this for a master thesis, I would have not accepted this to be your tutor, because objectively there is not so much you can add to what we already know. Because you're supposed in a master thesis to dig in, even already into something that is already never being researched at that point. But so it was, and I remember the first difficulty I had at that point was writing something meaningful that was consistent with essentially the history, the bibliography already existed on the topic. I mean, I couldn't really. The first thing I did was to basically write something on my own, really what I thought I knew about it, and just picking sources here and there. Then I handed the first, it was I think the first chapter or the first pages really to my professor, who told me, hand it to them so I will give a look to it if you're doing well or not. And she immediately told me, look, this is not very good, you have to be, and she gave me extra bibliography, because, for professors it's really annoying when students ask them for direct bibliographical advice, because obviously they're usually glad to do it, but it's not that even professors are. I mean, they're definitely acquainted with much, but even this is something you understand better when you go on, is that you don't really know everything that has been written ever, so they usually tend to give you some basic reads that you're supposed at that point to be searching for your own. But if you've never researched those in that on that subject and so on, objectively you might have difficulties at the beginning, and you might ask them. So that's how I did, and in fact I started following at that point, and that was a kind of a it stopped me a little, the enthusiasm and everything, because I realized also I had perhaps not made a good impression to my tutor, that eventually was very glad about my work, because I had for this inability that at that point was kind of normal, of me being able to search into bibliography and saying, what is that you have to read? Everything that has, that topic on the title, what you can't orient it because you haven't read those books. So in part, it's perfectly normal. So then it worked, and naturally she followed me, and I was kind of glad. And well, at that point, it's also the relation you have with your tutor. My tutor has been the tutor for all three of my theses now, with Bachelor, Master, and a PhD. So, and she's a brilliant person. She's very sensitive. So she's kind of similar to me in many ways. I also partly, obviously I learned a freaking lot from her, and so in historical terms, she also learned from me, because at this point, especially when you're very advanced in certain topics, you obviously start to know more. At the end of your PhD, or the last year especially, you're supposed to know already more than, because you're expected to have already found out something new in general. So at that point, you should be like the most updated person on that topic in the world, possibly. Obviously this is never possible, because there is always someone who already knows more than you in that field, but this is also the idea, that you kind of try to find your own thing and to develop it if nobody had already done it. And truly, at that point, it's mostly through the studies that you get to know the sources, I believe, because at that point the professor, the tutor usually tells you, first of all, the tutor is supposed to tell you what sources you have to look for. So those are, and those are no, I mean, I already knew what the sources were at that point, so I didn't need to ask her really in that case what the sources were. But also in here, you understand that you can get acquainted to the sources at that point, but still not knowing how to interpret them correctly, and especially not knowing what others have already interpreted them like. So that's why at that point historiography is so important, and because there are so many people who have written and thought about this, that you can obviously can't do much but learning from them the essentials and trying to reformulate them a little bit. So this is the idea. The idea of the tutor has normally to be a professor. Actually, not even of your university, but in that case, you still have need a co-tutor or something like that. But as a co-tutor, especially if your professor is internal, you can choose really anyone. I mean, you can choose a co-tutor basically whoever the university accepts as co-tutor. It can be also a person who doesn't have a degree in history in this case. I was tempted to do it because there is a professor that I know that could have helped me, but at the end of the day, I'm kind of a loner. I prefer to work alone and not to bother people, so I didn't. But technically you can really many contemporaries even use as co-tutors maybe the same sources that they interview, for instance, sometimes if they have titles, if they are acquainted. So this is interesting in many ways. As a medievalist, you can't do this, of course, but you still can find many people who are kind of willing to help you in this sense. And this also depends largely on how your university is organized and what your personal relation with the professors is. If they can help you. If you're having a good relation with your tutor is very important, because sometimes there are professors that you just can't stand. For instance, during my master thesis, I was translating certain things from Middle High German, and we have a professor in our department who is kind of an expert about that. She wrote something about the Minnesänger and stuff like that. So, but since I had a terrible experience with her years before in one during exams, I decided not to contact her at all. Yes, I did pass the exam. It was not the point. We had an argument substantially, and one of the few times it happened in my my university experience, fortunately, because I can be also pretty warlike. No, I propagandate my idea that there was an attrition there, but it was also the manners that I didn't like. Whatever, this is not a point now. The point I was making is I didn't ask her, and instead and that was not a thesis in German philology. That was on actually medieval German history. But I didn't talk to her, and basically asked for help to many foreign Germanists at that point, who helped me via internet and were extremely kind of polite, and especially professors from the Anglo-Saxon world have this very easygoing and very polite and nice and smart way to communicate with their students. They're very very much open and available, and accommodate friendly and so on. So I had a beautiful experience with that. Probably even if it was a thesis about military history, possibly the most beautiful part was translating those verses in Middle High German, both on my own and with the help of those professors. Incredibly enough, knowing a bit of German, I managed to understand many things on my own, so I kind of reinvented me as a Germanist. Of course I had to ask for help for certain passages that were kind of a bit too austic. But just for saying that if I had been a German philologist at that point, the theory is I would have had problems not to to work with that professor I had an argument with. So at university things like this happen. I mean, unfortunately, and I'm usually a non-conflictual person, but things can go wrong in some way. And I don't know, maybe she would have helped me. I mean, it's not that she was a terrible monster, but I just didn't want to do it for matters of stupid pride and arrogance and stuff like that. But whatever. So I never had those problems. But there was a point in which I wanted to write a master thesis actually in Roman history. I literally changed the idea the summer before the year I wrote my master thesis. And I had contacted this professor initially, a Roman history I had given an exam with, and it was fine, really. I had written a thesis with him. Also in there had been a bit of an attrition because of a silly thing, but he was, I can say a strange person, but it's to say that characterally we weren't really matching. So I decided to come back to my tutor and to remain faithful to her. And these are normal things, your normal questions that you have. And at that point, it's very important to plan these things not really in advance, but really being serious and honest with yourself. I mean, my problem at that point was kind of this psychological problem of saying, I've already made a thesis with that tutor. Maybe I should change, or maybe I should do something. So, but even in that case, the same tutor made me understand, it's not really a big deal. It's just a master thesis, and this is the point I also making today. Don't over, because every time I had to write a thesis, I thought that it required a much bigger and serious amount of work than what it was actually needed. And I also did an extra load of work because of this, because the expectation was much bigger than reality. So even the actual quality of this works is not really very much assessed by the people who evaluate that. I mean, in most of university, I'm surely it's a formality in the sense that once the person has seen you have worked. Also, tutors cannot really, my tutor was extremely serious and read all of my thesis, but it's not that she got into every single source to go check. I mean, I had made, I don't know, 600 notes. I don't know what. Obviously, she didn't read everything. She also didn't know practically anything in that case about my master thesis. So at that point, you realize how much on your own you can be, if it's the case that your tutor doesn't know much about the topic. I know that most of the times this is not really the strategical way people deal with this, because most people would search actually the great expert to make the thesis, but that can become a bit weird, especially if the person is kind of, I don't know even to define it, but problematic, difficult, because usually great experts have their ideas in mind, their narratives, their interpretation. They're surely very sophisticated, in fact, as experts, but they can tend to choke the initiative of the student. So sometimes it's really a matter of also being free is very important in these works. Because you're already under pressure by certain standards, if you add to that the ingerence and interference of someone, usually that is very positive, wants your work to be reformulated, reframed, and that is maybe kind of refusing what you're writing on your own. It can be very bad in many ways, and so sometimes it's better also to search for that right compromise between the having a point of reference but really remain autonomous on your own. And I really prefer the second thing, and in my case I was probably the most autonomous person at one point, especially when in parallel with the increase in responsibility, I've always been left increasingly on my own. So the bachelor thesis actually went well. I wrote this thing, as I said, it took me 3 months. I wrote 160 pages. It was overall fine. And I must say that when I got my degree, that was actually I can say it was actually my most emotional moment, possibly. I don't remember now when I finished high school whether it was something like that, but I felt very accomplished at that time. During the master thesis, I didn't. I think in my PhD, if we will go, it will be successful. Also, I will not feel the same emotions, but it was kind of a nice moment. And my parents were there, other colleagues were. So I kind of. It wasn't about that because I'm not a very sociable person in the first place, but it kind of made sense, and I was happy to have finally a title, something that I could keep for myself mostly, because I knew that title was empty, because I had went through it. I mean, empty in the sense I knew what was behind that. So this is why also I'm making this video, because I'm telling you what it is practically to do it. Maybe I should tell more how I process this, but every work is kind of different. So, for instance, in a bachelor thesis, I followed, as we were saying, mostly studies. So picking a bit from everyone and making a story overall, what I was searching for, hinting at sources, quoting them in part, but overall keeping it general. Although I kind of investigated various aspects of that topic, and it came out a good thesis because it also was kind of well framed. It had a sense. It was chronologically split. Also it was thematic in certain parts. So it was really fairly well done. And this is why also I would like to talk about it, maybe on Schwerpunkt when I talk about the history of the Longobards, military history, because that can be useful. It can be, I can put it in this sense online and translate it in this fashion. Now, with the master thesis, the master thesis normally takes 2 years of university, and that's a very few overall. So after the bachelor thesis, I had lost a year because I could have done it even at the beginning, of the following year. I mean, starting my master thesis, but I didn't take that opportunity. I still had a couple of exams to make, and I probably had the time to write a thesis in the meanwhile, but it would have been too much pressure. Then I would have also need to condensate the new exams, the beginning of the first year of the master. So I said, screw this, and I just lost plain the year. So that was very interesting because basically I finished in March. I had 6 months before the new academic year started, and I had that was probably one of the most beautiful years in my life. I traveled finally a lot after years that I maybe went only once or twice a year in vacation. I have read a freaking lot of things. Importantly, after 3 years, finally I had the time to read what the hell I wanted. I was already looking for a topic for master thesis, and I got interested also quite randomly about the topic of my master thesis. It's something I met, I think, for the first time. I think at the first exam of medieval history, I had read it, then I'd forgotten about it. Then eventually, in this period, I reread from certain books about medieval warfare, about this battle once again, that eventually would be the topic of my master thesis. And I tried to search at that point for sources, because at that point I realized that the master thesis would have been much more structural, and that's what you have to remember about it. The master thesis at that point is really different from the bachelor, because in master thesis you have to show essentially that you're able to master the craft of the historian in terms of sources, quoting, and you can't really skip. Everything starts from there, and you have to be kind of very, very methodical, very, very precise, very, very aware at 100% of what you're writing from the sources and from the bibliography. Which is what in the bachelor thesis, as we've seen, you're not really fully required to. I mean, that's just a topic you want to discuss, and it's fine as long as you quote everything right. You don't have a lot of individual criticism or great a very deep research to do. That essentially just have to show what that you're capable of quoting right. And with a master thesis, it's much more structural, and even in there, listening to the words of my tutor, I felt that the master thesis was a very big thing, and especially that I had to talk about something new, and which is probably something in my mind I overly emphasized, and I thought it was so important, and objectively not so much. Actually, the bachelor thesis I wrote was kind of right even for a master thesis. After all, it wasn't so, in spite of what my tutor told me, that could have passed in some way, and just dipping a bit more in the sources, that it could have been easily a master thesis also for length. But this topic was new to me. I decided to choose as a military historian a battle. a battle essentially for this very reason, that I had great plans in mind. I wanted to write a thesis on the vexata quest of the, Manipular Legion versus Macedonian phalanx, and that's why I contacted with a professor Roman history, who also was not a military historian. And I deeply distrusted other military historians on that topic in my country. So also in that case, I would have done it on my own. Then I thought, that's kind of a big thing. Of course, that's that. And you say, by the way, you're a medievalist. You do a thesis in ancient history. Yeah, you can do it. If at least in my university, if you have done during your studies, during the degree, at least one exam about a certain topic, you can basically pick that, whatever it is, and make a thesis into that, and still getting in a degree in medieval history, even though you didn't. You can do it both bachelor thesis and the master's. It is in case of my university, but I guess it's like that pretty much everywhere. Um, so I chose the battle because I said, the battle is something much narrower. After all, it's just the event of this battle, its importance, and so this 12 battalion that maybe it's not so fashionable today, but essentially with the new military history, we're recovering that. So I also thought, I was reasoning very economically at that point, because I was saying, I've lost 3 months for writing a bachelor thesis, so now the master will take me master thesis will take me 6 months, and I want something smaller. It ended up taking one whole, perhaps not one whole year, because I wrote it eventually in the second year of the master. I still had 2 exams to give, because essentially with a master thesis, at least my university tends to concentrate all the most of the exams of the degree in the first year, so to give time to the student for essentially writing the master thesis. That is considered something, in fact, consistently important for letting the student more free in the second year. During the bachelor degree, you don't have like that, because it's considered really, in fact, a relatively small work. So I was looking in that in that vacation, let's say, before the beginning of the master thesis, certain sources about this battle, that it was really not very much. There's not a great. This battle is not very publicized. I'm not going saying what it is, because probably I will talk about it on Schwerpunkt one day. But for now, it's a major battle of the second half of 13th century Germany, and at least in my country, nothing had been written about it explicitly before I wrote about it as a monography, let's say. So all the bibliography was in German, by the way. I had to, it seemed to me as something very complicated. I had not the few studies existing on this battle were not even available in my country, so we had to ship them from Germany and all this stuff. But that was not the problem. The point is, I was deeply fascinated with this battle, and during the first year, however, of master thesis, I said, okay, maybe that requires too much. Let's stick to the Roman warfare thesis. And I had that kind of strange interaction with that professor, and eventually I decided, after all, I wanted to come back on that medieval battle that fascinated me so much. And another professor, that not from my university, is actually a guy who was taught economics, but he's a great military historian that I greatly admire. And I asked help to him, and he sent me certain digitalized books I had missed from the 19th century. Actually, they were talking about this battle, and then I finally got access to the sources, and that's what I wanted to do, because that's essentially what you have to look at in the master thesis. And so at that point, I started reading through the sources, and I said, okay, I can do this, because there were mostly sources in Latin. There was a bit of Middle High German, but it was nothing scary. I finally have some ground, some consistent bibliography to start from, and okay, let's do this. So basically, I fortunately finished everything in time during the first year. Now in the second year, I had just 2 exams left, and or 3, I don't remember. So there wasn't big much. So I started working this thesis. Also, in this case, I had no one helping me. Excuse me. As I said before, in this case, I had no one helping me really closely as a military historian, and I went mostly on my own. So I had all that bibliography collected. I started reading it, translating it, and using it. It took me 1 whole year. Now I won't bother you with the nuisances of all the translation, the problems that I had. But I wrote actually a very good. I can't say I wish I had written it better, honestly. But it was also in here pretty massive thing. It was 260 pages long, and it took me. Yeah, I started reading into the sources in July, and I basically finished in September of the following year, with all those other things happening in the middle. Of course, I did this because I had time, so I could basically, let's say, dilute all the research to make it, calmly and with all my mind fresh without hurry. Obviously, there was to hurry, like it always happens. So, a great advice for every kind of thesis you want to write is calculate your time. Try to be realistic and always take a lot of time of reserve. Don't hurry, because hurry is bad for the quality of your work. It makes you do a mistake, to approximate, and with a master thesis, it's not something you can do. With a master thesis, I proceeded really looking at what you're supposed to do, essentially, looking at source by source. And obviously, I was immensely guided here also by the bibliography that fortunately was kind of you could dominate that. It was something because the problem of bibliography today is that sometimes it's too large about a certain topic. Fortunately, that battle inexplicably was kind of forgotten, even relatively forgotten, even in the German world, where it had a massive importance. It actually should be studied worldwide, in my opinion. And very few people know what it was. And it was, first of all, a beautiful experience, because finally I got to work on the sources, and I understood at that methodological level how important it is to know how to study the sources. I mean, really understood that the step I took, even with the bachelor thesis, I realized now certain things. With the bachelor thesis, I learned how to write a scientific text, using sources, bibliography, being proper. Okay, with the master thesis, I went beyond. With the master thesis, I went at the point that basically could dominate. The topic was, I was studying, really having consulted really, I think, a 90-95% of everything that had ever been written there. There was a book, incidentally, had been written in a Slavic country a few years before about that very battle, and I don't know any Slavic language, so I couldn't translate this book. And there was no translation around, so I kind of ignored that, but I don't think it was actually a very strictly military. Obviously, yeah, it was the history of that battle, but I think it took into consideration several other aspects. I don't know. I still haven't read that book. I still don't think there is a translation available. But just for saying that theoretically you should be, at that point, aware of literally everything that has been written to be proper, because the problem is that you should come up with something on your own. Meaning that what you have written is not just, in fact, just repeating what others have said, but also telling your own opinion about this, and in theory adding something new to what has been written bibliographically speaking. And I was proud of having written that also for many reasons, many other reasons. I fell in love terribly with especially with the source, with the one in Middle High German. It was stunning before, and I visited the battlefield in Austria, in actually last year, almost 1 year ago now, and it was fantastic. It was a kind of a mystical experience for me. I don't know. Maybe one day I will open up on this topic, and I will try to be more to explain the whole history of the battle. It will take me like 20 videos to do it at that point. For saying how, working one whole year on a single battle. Of course, I studied also the campaign, but that gives you a dimension already how difficult it is to study something in real depth already in the second half of the 13th century in Germany. That is not an excessively documented place. Just imagine what it means to study even things that come later, and what it means to really dominate a topic historically speaking, because this is what it gives you at that point, a really master degree, that you understand that basically nobody, I mean most of the people, even of the historians that discuss history, for the sake of of didactics, they can't and they don't know everything. I mean, they can be experts just on that tiny bit of history, because being truly expert means that you have really read all the sources, all the studies that have been written about that topic. And even in a lifetime of studies, you can't cover even a minimal part of all we have in just, I don't know, the Middle Ages. So it's mostly a matter of, it teaches you also to be humble, to know that, look, that history, this is really what history is. And about accomplishment, yeah, I was proud of having written that thesis, perhaps, from a strictly historical point of view, more than definitely I was writing the bachelor thesis, but it gave me kind of less satisfaction. First of all, because I wish I could have dedicated more time to it. Secondly, because I was also distracted by the PhD selection that I was very absorbing. I read, I think, in one summer 10,000 pages about even more about manuals, medieval history. I fortunately likely passed this selection and I got into it. Also, that was a problem with the PhD project, because as we will see, that is a very complicated thing to do, and it's probably the most important thing to discuss. So the master gives you this broader depth really in what the craft of the historian is at that point, and that's why that's called master degree, because in theory you should be mastering the craft at that point. So it's 5 years of university at that point, 3 plus 2 with these 2 theses, and you have written, in my case, 420 pages. Well, that's not bad, plus the other theses, small works I had, small texts I had written for the other exams. You can go on. Now, the last chapter is the PhD thesis. Now, PhD is, what is the PhD? Master thesis, as we've seen, is basically a completion, I don't know how to say that, a fulfillment, the idea now that you're not just someone who is taking a sheet of paper to say that you have a degree, but taking it further, even with less work, because objectively you study much less during the master degree in terms of quantity of exams and so on than into the bachelor one. But really pointing at the quality of a quality work that supposedly has to make you arrive at a point at which you essentially all the options that are open to the historian. From a methodological point of view, in terms of knowing where the historian has to search for. Also in here, it's much more, it really depends on your experience, what you have worked with, or about which topic, and this is valid now. I'm talking just as a medievalist, but you can imagine how this experiences wildly vary on the base. In fact, if you're studying ancient history, where you have really a very few sources, for instance, where you studied modern age or contemporary age, where you have way too many sources already from the 14th century, it becomes very hard to look at everything for a work like that. So basically, I started my PhD thesis without, I think, an adequate preparation, because and this is a very important strategical point. I chose a topic that was almost completely unrelated to the one of my bachelor and master thesis. In perspective, I wish today I had already written something before my PhD thesis about my PhD topic, which I didn't. And I know in many ways it's pretty dumb, because aside from being topics of military history, all these topics have basically nothing in common. Perhaps, yeah, I switched from second half of 13th century Germany to first half of 14th century Italy, and it's not so distant after all. It was also plenty of Germans, German mercenaries in this context in the Italian peninsula. Italy was still tied a lot to the German politics. There were several German campaigns in Italy at that point. So it even in the eventuality of a postdoc, I might think about coupling the two things. It would be actually very fascinating. It would be a pretty good opportunity as well if I ever get it, if I'm lucky. But the problem is that, yeah, I got into these sources without having basically the adequate preparation. I mean, it was literally me now having won this place, this scholarship, having to literally reread manuals of that specific topic, and to get the essentials, to get certain bibliographical advices. The problem at that point is really also the bibliography, because I believe that the PhD in itself is also in here not inherently so different from those other theses, in the sense that especially if you work on the sources, you are, I mean, the sources are those, so that's paradoxically the least problematic thing. The problem in a PhD is that, at least for a sense of formality and decent behavior, you should basically dominate already from the first year all the existing bibliography that has, I can say more remotely to do with your topic, but say that has covered your topic in a way or in another. And 50 years ago, this was not a child's play, but it was way easier than today. I mean, today we have such a huge and endless amount of bibliography. We basically don't even know what to do with it, because realistically, you don't even have the time. Even if I had to seriously look at all, and this is a problem also with my colleagues at this point, that are writing now a PhD thesis. For me it's next year, but for them, they realized, that they gave up at a certain point. They say, even in the thesis they wrote, I couldn't cover all that has been written for this thing, so it's just me maybe narrowing. Usually PhD projects are very, very ambitious. Then naturally there is this tendency during the same PhD to narrow it down to something much smaller, to dominate these sources. And this is happening also with my project, and I'm still writing something now, I think too big for even the time I have. I technically can't suspend the PhD and keep working on my own and then restarting it. I could do it, and I'm thinking about doing that, because it's really a matter of time. It's not really about the work that is kind of challenging in itself. Especially my thesis poses so many methodological problems that I don't even know why I brought myself into this. But this is not important. The problem with the PhD thesis is that most of all, you should say something radically, I mean, maybe not radical, but consistently new about that specific field. PhD also focuses much on the on the innovation, basically, that you can bring. There is a sort of race of kind of for because the PhD is oriented towards the so-called research, which we don't properly know what it means, in my opinion, because here we're playing with words many times. I mean, every single historian is making a research, and naturally, people who go on between, they pass from a university to an academic career, they're expected to produce something that is scientifically very valid. So they're researchers by definition. They should they should be part of the intelligence of their own country, and being, the kind of more innovative force. But this stress for innovation is actually too emphasized, in my opinion, especially in my field. I mean, one thing is searching into science, into certain fields where you actually have you even have your country maybe has even a strategical interest for developing certain technologies, certain know-how, and so on. With history, it's very different, because, and also in there, by the way, also in science, obviously there is a huge reconsideration of certain things that you can definitely work on so many, but it is slightly different. With history, I think that you can always kind of to look once again at certain topics and kind of trying to deepen them or look in them from different perspectives. And now it sounds bad because it sounds revisionism, I know, but to revise is essentially the task of every kind of student. What does the student do before the exam? He's essentially looking fastly to revising what he has to do to write. That's what a historian also can do, and therefore there is this tendency that sometimes get also into a political direction to say, okay, let's reward this person who has written this work because it's so innovative, it opens towards different perspectives and different directions. But objectively, there is so much to know about the history we already know sometimes, that I believe people who search into these new fields, that they're just racing towards where no one has ever been. But not that those topics are maybe so many. After all, if nobody expanded into those topics, maybe it's because there was not a great interest. At least, obviously, society changes and so on. But certain time you hear this. I had this unfortunate duty to attend all the various PhD project presentations. Well, every year there are the new students who present themselves and so on. And some of these PhDs, you can understand how they wildly vary in both in content and quality. I mean, some of them are, and surely they're all interesting. I'm not saying that it's bad that there is all this diversity and this heterogeneity, let's say, better in this field, but at the same time, sometimes you wonder, but yeah, okay, this topic is so important, but do we have so many perspectives for this to evolve as a field? That is a problem, and naturally now it's extremely complicated even to point this out. But let's say that even I'm speaking from a perspective like medieval history, and I'm sure many people out there say, well, medieval history, who cares? Like, right? Hopefully most of you, since my channel at this point at least is still predominantly based on medieval history, probably do not think so. But there might be a rightful question I might also make a video on, is how is actually what, okay, history is important and we know it, but what's the practical benefit from studying certain things? That is a challenge to answer, because it's easy to respond very idealistic and romantic things, but I think that you have to give a sense to many of the, and I particularly feel this because as I've told many times also on Schwerpunkt, there is a tendency in the academy today, pretty much everywhere, at least in the West, I'm sure also in the rest of the world, to narrow, to hyper specialize. I mean, to form scholars as extremely experts, extreme experts on a particular field. There's something you can achieve basically narrowing all your perspective down to that field. And normally today, most professors basically know only about what their PhD has been about, and do nothing throughout their life until the grave, basically to expand substantially around that topic. And as a result, and I think this is a very important problem from a cultural point of view, we lack generalists. We lack people who have an omnicomprehensive vision of the world, which, especially in a globalized world like ours, is kind of risky, because we need to look at how things work on a global scale, on increasing perspective, both from a political, military, environmental point of view. And when you narrow everything down to just one perspective, the result is that your know-how basically is sterile. For solving certain problems, you don't have the experts that can cope with a general idea. Um, and this evolves at so many levels, culturally speaking, for which basically everyone seems to have his or own field of specialization, but he or she doesn't practically have a consistent idea of what the overall business would would deal with the world is, basically. This is a broader consideration that I might also here develop into another video. But let's say the PhD is a bit, especially at the beginning, a sort of a leap in the darkness. It's just a leap of faith. Your ability is to dislocate yourself into this very weird universe where theoretically you should become to the leading expert, and you don't really know how to start. And another great problem in this is that also the nature of university in itself. I mean, university up to 50 years ago, let's say, was about really going there to build a personal culture, a personal education. And it would be the generation of my professors that now they're like in their 60s, almost their 70s, and they're going all to and they're retiring. They are the boomers, basically. So there will be also this massive aftershock, in my opinion, for this generational dynamics, for which there will be a very wide gap, generational gap, also in terms of education of models, because of our current endemic trends. So we have to expect a world now that will be increasingly worried about not getting the whole picture. And back in the day, when our professors studied, they were studying from monsters, I mean in the positive sense, that say giants better, that objectively were quite weird people, because they might have been political, they might have been kind of also maybe very narrow, bigoted in their own way, in a broad sense. But there were people who had a very different education, basically had studied everything. There were those people who usually had lived into, the age of, they had seen the rise of totalitarianism, they had been through World War II, had lived to this very intensely also political, sometimes also religious life that shaped their worldview and etc. and tried this great interpretation. Especially in the Middle Ages, this was done very, because and these people pretended from their students still the knowledge of something similar that was, I mean just for the fact of learning from them, you understood so much in a wider sense. And university, at least in my country, was probably much tougher at the time, which is a general impression that I got. I still can't really understand whether this is true or not, but I've heard stories of something we studied, they studied that we absolutely didn't study, and probably we will not be studying for quite a lot of time. Even in sheer quantity of thing. At that time, university also was just for the elite in some ways, and therefore there were already people who had maybe a very solid, good education, who read a lot. Today we're not like that anymore. So even as elite, we are much more ignorant than our predecessors. But could also be profitably questioned. I think there are pros and cons, because I believe also next generations will have a complete different. Let's leave aside the moral aspects and values and so on, but they will have radically different historical questions that it will pose, which is very interesting, because this is if the second half of the 20th century had all expanded towards one trend. Now everything is kind of collapsing, and you have to restart from different premises. I mean, collapsing in terms of also of knowledge education. That's what I meant, without being too catastrophic on other things. So also for those demographical dynamics we were talking about before. So at that time, professors actually were extremely cultured people, and they are. I mean, I have certain professors, at least now, some have retired, but who are told, there are rumors about the fact that they have covered actually most of the major literary historiographical sources of the whole Middle Ages, which obviously I could have not done personally, not even if I had dedicated the whole time of my life now at doing it. Or maybe, who knows? But now that's also the point. That university sometimes is also a great waste of time, because in between these tests, it's not that I personally or no one else that I know actually read much more on his or her own, unless they went we went out of losing years basically, because university obliges you also to stay there focused. And it in part, I mean, I'm relatively glad I went to university, but at the same time I recognize most of it was kind of a loss of time, especially in terms of my own individual expertise, because I think I never had a class of military history in my university. I had to learn everything on my own, and I'm not even that's a problem actually. So I feel generally, university more than else gives you a structure, and that's why the theses are so important, because those are the moments in which you don't just take for granted what you're studying from a book, but you actually write a book on your own. So you have to bother yourself with this quite. It's an honor and privilege to be able to have been given time to look into the sources and to look things on your own. So with the PhD thesis, it's it's really a mess, because first of all you have to plan a work that has to last 3 years, and when you begin you literally have no idea how it's gonna go. This is a common problem basically all the students have. Sometimes you suffer from great anxiety. I'm a bit anxious by character, but fortunately I have the time and patience to go into my work with calm. But it seems dramatically that now the PhD seems like the top. There's such the elite title, but it's actually pretty simple. And there is a great competition, however, for which it seems at least many PhD students and it is definitely true, I believe it, have great psychological problems, and there is a consistent number of depressed PhD students, also PhD students who commit suicide, and these rates are seemingly going up. This is sad, because also the PhD works in very different ways in different countries. I mean, in certain countries there is still a very good selection. I personally think to have been selected in a very impartial way, because basically I'm not aware of any other system now, but most of the other countries you basically pay to start a PhD, and that's it. Maybe you just present a project that has been written by someone else, and you go on with that. Obviously it's your point, but as long as you pay, it's like with the call for papers and this everything. The point now is it's become a business. It's just for university or these organizations, to receive money from scholars, from students who want their articles to be published for their curricula, and that's it. So you can imagine the drastic sinking in quality of these works, because everybody writes a shit ton of rubbish that nobody's gonna read, that is stupid, that it's not even properly written, nobody cares essentially. And the quality of the work does not exist anymore, and this is getting seriously worse. And that's therefore why also PhD is a real relative. It's not that a PhD is inherently a historical authority you have to listen to. And don't be tricked and don't be fooled. Even professors are kind of ignorant people most of the time. So on many fields, even the same historical field they're studying. I've told you many times how I myself, for instance, I obviously don't know. I'm not a great expert about most of the Middle Ages, and that's pretty obvious. and so many professors are, but at a certain point that you meet some of them that they don't even make the effort to bother themselves to have a general understanding of what they're studying. They narrow so much down to just their own topic that they don't know even basic medieval history. And this is happening all over the world, and this is embarrassing. And I don't know where we'll get to this, but it's really prominent. I was talking to you about before. Um, so it's a problem. Going back to the thesis, for whichever reason you do, whichever system it is, the PhD thesis is a very challenging thing because it's 3 years. You basically have to also to schedule a sort of path in this sense. Usually the first year, usually it's 3 years. There are PhDs that I'm aware can last also longer, but usually it's 3 years. Mine is 3 years at least. In the first year you're really free. The idea of PhD, I must say, is that you do basically whatever you want. You're an adult. You're already you have a master's degree. You're supposed to be completely self-sufficient. And as we have seen, also things like scholarships, other favors, let's say, you have, and so on, are meant just to let you be completely free to travel, to research, to do whatever you want, and that's why most PhDs are kind of scholarships are naturally very desired and naturally how do you say that the desired and craved for, because it's money essentially. So it's as if you were paid with a salary. But really the most important thing is what you do, in my opinion, your work. And so the first year you're supposed to have completed, however, in general, this is how things usually work. At least I know that in France and in Italy it is like this: is the first year you're supposed to have collected all the sources you're going to use in the research, and having in parallel done with all the bibliography that exists. And I haven't done it. I've done it just in part, but most of it, fortunately, so it's not a problem. I'm already actually writing now during the second year, which is not a few. In the second year, you're supposed to be looking at what you have collected in a very thorough, omnicomprehensive way. So sources plus bibliography. In the third year, you're supposed to be writing your thesis. And actually, the sources are meant most of the times to be new sources, especially for medievalists. The idea is that you have to go into some dusty archive to find finding something new out. And I'm also not doing this, interestingly enough, because I'm working on a very different thing that has. It's not really a historiographical reconsideration in general, but it's really looking at what you already have from a structural perspective on a certain topic. Now I won't explain essentially what this is, but it's still important to consider that you don't have to stick what really other people do. I think that the most remunerative, the most paying attitude you can have when you write a thesis is not to give a damn thing about what other people think about your thesis. As long as they're expert people who can give you advice and they're good, they know what they're saying, it's fine. But ultimately the person who decides, who's moved by this passion, who has this interest, is you, and nobody can tell you what you have to do in practice. And this is valid for all the theses. So that's the idea. Characterally, I tend not to follow other people, but and I got terrific advice from many experts. Sometimes very uninterested advice. They're just people who knew I was studying in old times and said, okay, if I need anything, if you have a question, I ask. I like to ask, but it's just because I have a pre-existing question in my mind, and I just want to figure out what the answer is on my own, and I need someone maybe who already knows to help me. but everything has to start from yourself. While I know that throughout all these paths, actually most people tend to do what their tutors tell them to do. So the this is sometimes this means really depending on the tutor, especially if there are certain. I mean, this is also known that certain PhDs are won by certain students because basically they are a kind of sub top field of interest of the professor, of the tutor that follows them, that basically wants eventually to use also that research for themselves. So they basically make them pass if they have the right topic they can decide. Naturally, the tutor is very it can be interested in this sense, but obviously it's not so dramatic as it sounds, but it's pretty obvious. Also, tutors here are chosen sometimes very easily. It's not really a big deal, and the best obviously for a PhD, especially for a PhD, would be being followed by a tutor that knows what you're studying. And that's also what I didn't do. So I'm collecting mistakes along the way. I have a kind of strange historical intuition that sometimes brought up to this point has always kept me on the right track. Incredibly enough, even not having been expert in certain field, I always kind of sensed more or less what was the direction I had to take by myself. It's partly an instinct of survival when you don't have anyone helping you, so you have to figure out certain things by yourself. But that's the point. You should be able to do it on your own, and not just to follow the advice of someone, the track of someone else, if it's possible. Then, obviously, if you are so interested in following in extending the research of a professor, it's perfectly fine. Also freely, it's not that because it has to be imposed, but the relation between tutors and students can be very strained. For instance, also other things might happen. For instance, I had a colleague, a PhD colleague, who basically lost, without anything dramatic, fortunately, his tutor when he was at the third year. If I'm not wrong, yeah, at the third year of his, so the last year, and arguably also partially, at least the most, well, it's still an important one. They're all important years of the research, and he had to work. By the way, he had also other problems because he had basically wasted 1 year because he had not found enough sources where if he thought it could find them, so he had to restart to reinvent a little bit. So fortunately, my own tutor followed him at the time, and he wrote a very good PhD thesis, so I'm actually very glad for him. And but the point here is really, yeah, that things can happen. Yeah, I know people who got hurt, even women who got pregnant legitimately, they had special time they can take for suspending the PhD momentarily, and then and then restarting it sometimes. So starting a PhD it's really a life choice. It's like starting another degree, objectively, and it's quite difficult to you have to start with the right foot in many ways. You have to be determined. You have to know what you want. You have to put into account that it can also fail, because there are many people who give up the PhD because they say, okay, I didn't have time, or maybe they're working and they hope they can do like that. But I advise, obviously, a good the PhD is the last step of the university career. In the past it was like the very first step of the academic career. Now it's very different, unfortunately. So that it takes, now there are also postdocs, there are other like 2 or 3 years of research, and so it goes on and on and on because of all the problems we know in our society now. Problems over employment, steady jobs are difficult to find and all this stuff. But theory is, if you have chosen this way in your life, you just go all the way along it, because it's all the way down it, because it's really worth the try. I realize that many people can't really choose because maybe they have to work, but I believe that sometimes it's better to make some sacrifice and then really feeling accomplished with something you truly liked than having been wondering your whole life about it and saying, okay, well, you know what, I wish I had done it. And that's, I think, the worst. I think I couldn't stand it. I was obviously, I was, in my life, I think extremely lucky in many ways, because I could do this. And I was also lucky because sometimes maybe I didn't even, the selection, for instance, I think I passed by chance because I actually saw the person, during the selection extracting manually the trace I had to write for my written proof that is actually the most important one, choosing that trace instead of another that was something completely different from what I knew, and I was lucky in that sense. Obviously, I wrote a decent thing, but I was lucky, and there are so many things that can go wrong. For instance, the morning of the PhD selection, I was with my motorcycle going to university, and I got into a sort of car chase with a guy who wanted to run me over, because a very intense, violent thing. Fortunately, I got, well, now it's not worth explaining it, but just for saying there are many stupid things that can happen. So I was fortunate up to this point to have made it in many ways, and so I realize maybe I'm bit too, too it's easy for me to talk, but there are many other people who make huge sacrifices, also even just for studying, and I have all my respect, and even with the time I have, I objectively wasted, but I'm still working something, so I'm relatively fine still with it, and I don't know how it will be afterwards, but it's an important path. So the thesis is this. Obviously, I don't know. I'm still writing my thesis, and I think I will tell you at the end how it was if I will make it. And naturally, a PhD thesis is usually something pretty consistent. Usually, the length can vary. There are also different national traditions. I know, for instance, in France, usually the average PhD thesis. In France there is a great there is a sort of tradition. I mean, different countries have different traditions. Usually, PhD thesis is 400 pages. In other countries, it's shorter. Usually, some theses are rubbish. At every stage, you always find a guy that writes stupid things, and that's natural in many ways. And that's even good because it means it has pros and cons. I mean, from one side, it shows that really everyone can arrive to that point. At the same time, this tells maybe in the selection there is not a great selection process. There is not a huge, but at least I don't know. In my experience, people who get there are usually better than the average. So it's still something that works. I don't know in my case. In my case, I was, as I told you, I felt very lucky. But I will be writing. I'm actually still writing this thing, and it's very complicated naturally, and I feel I have some problem at this point because it's getting very long, and I also need. I don't know how much time it will take, but I hope to make it, and that's what I'm confident I will keep working at it unless something terrible happens in my life. I don't know, but there are ways to assist the students like this. And it's essentially a great work. It's a great work of insight. At that point, I don't even know. This at the end, the thesis get reviewed by certain experts. They're usually truly experts about the topic you have chosen. And I don't know up to that point, especially when a thesis is very long. Sometimes they even tell you, cut some parts down. And I don't know how much they really understand fully every thesis, because also reading is not easy. Today I wanted actually to make a video on the difference between reading and understanding, or learning, studying, these things, because it's very easy, especially in history, to get misinterpreted and not to fully understand the reasons, that's why obviously we need experts to review these works. But let's say that I believe it will come soon to change also a bit perspective we'll look at these works, and probably will create new criteria to value these things, because I think we got too much in love with this, as I've said before, with this hyper specialization, for which uh, the academy tends to want these extremely punctilious things about that specific thing that is so narrow that ultimately nobody's going to read. I mean, when I started the PhD, another very important thing is, then I told me, what do you want to do with this? It's a unique opportunity. Um, it happens once in your life. You have it. You have kind of sweated relatively hard for this. Just write something that leaves a mark. Why should I write something that is so focusedly and narrowed on, like, I don't know, just, but I can't, I don't know if you're into these things now, wherever you are, who's listening to this, but, sometimes certain topics are so narrow, like the history of a tiny village between, I don't know, the 30 years of a history in, I don't know, the 14th century. I mean, obviously, if there is material, it's amazing, it's a beautiful thing, but objectively, who's gonna read it? I mean, of course, other historians who are interested in that, they can connect those studies with their own and have this, but sometimes they're so very narrow that you're not even really sure what's, sometimes it seems that it's for the sake of itself. I'm trying to write something that is probably will be read also kind of internationally, because it's something I decided to shape also in a fashion that resembles other theses, like the one of De Vries, like early 14th century infantry warfare, or 14th century, I don't remember. It was a PhD thesis of his, for instance, and that has been my model. I want to do the same thing partly with my own topic, but it's it's difficult sometimes. It's you question really, because this is really the problem also relative to anxiety, and where there are so many depressed people that when it gets to these things, they are pushed even just maybe by this psychological disturbs in their research and so on. They have this spasmodic need for success and accomplishment, because objectively you really never know how it's gonna end. I mean, in all these stages now, if you look at them in perspective afterwards, you say, okay, I was heading towards that direction, and at that time I didn't know, because until I didn't do certain things, I didn't know how it was. Now you look ahead and you say, okay, but what's next now? So, and in part, obviously, it's only you who can answer this question. At the same time, there are people who are already ahead and can give you some advice. I try to give you, some hint of what it practically this word thing is, and I don't know, but it's important that you know that it's normal to be anxious, that it's normal that things are difficult, that it's normal that, however, difficulties can be overcome if you truly, not just if you truly believe, because believing is really like the first step. If you really don't believe in yourself, you really think, nah, it's better for someone else, maybe you're fooling yourself. This is also true, but so you should especially at a certain age, assess what your true capabilities are, and sometimes just even give up, saying, okay, I tried this, I thought it was different. For instance, I started 1 year of economics before studying history and said, okay, I'm not good for this. I also got rejected for psychological things from I went to military academy tests, I failed those at the psychological level. I also tried to enter into medicine, but I hadn't studied that summer for the test, so I didn't pass. So with history instead, I know what failure kind of is. I started that year of economic, I got bored and I left. I gave up because I honestly said, okay, this is not for me. It's not a matter of me not believing in myself. On the contrary, it's exactly because I believe in myself that I'm perfectly aware that this is, I've tried it. I'm kind of happy of it. I'm even happy, of course, of what I've learned in there, but it's not for me. I started studying history. I didn't know how it was, of course. I obviously loved history already, but I started. I saw I was kind of good at it. At least it was suited for me, and I I kept going on. And I believe that great part of life is really like this: is that you don't have even to. I mean, it's good to make plans, to make projections, to have ambitions, to be able to look at yourself in the future. But at the same time, there's certain things you have to go on, kind of in a rational way, by saying, okay, I can't be so. Now I'm tired. I don't know whether I will make it. There are so many difficulties. It's hard, but objectively, the advice is hang on, because if you know that that's the right way, if you know that you're doing this for good, you should go on. You should be consistent with your choices, even if you don't make it in the end. It doesn't matter, but at least you have tried, because up to that point, if you don't take the train, um, if you don't try, you will be doing such a great damage to your life. You will such a great harm, because failure is actually the key for success. It's not really an anecdotal statement. It's really true. Until you don't know what difficulties are, you can't progress, because you don't know how to cope with them, and until you don't meet them. So it's perfectly normal, and that's what you're supposed to experience: difficulties. And in this path with the thesis, that's exactly this. You start from a level that you know virtually nothing how all these things work, and then you go on and you say, wow, but it's now I know how it is, but I still have doubts. Okay, now that you know that it happens in this way, just go on. Don't worry about it. Just study, just be patient, be precise, be methodical. Everything will go well if you keep going on like that, and this is valid for every path. Now I talk about thesis in medieval history, so many of you will probably get into it. I mean, I'm picturing you now as the average population, and of course you're probably already interested. Some of you are already well acquainted. They're surely even more ahead than me. But this is valid. This is what I wanted to say, is that this is valid for every single path, from school to life to work, family. I think everything. And life is not easy, and sometimes this is I know it's so banal to say, but we have to acknowledge that problems are always going to be here. So we can either kind of demoralize ourselves and say, oh, but it's too difficult, I want to give up, and so on. Or we can take a stand, and we can say, okay, this is a problem, okay, but I can make it, I can solve the problem. And if I solve the problem, I get a better life, I obtain something, I achieve something. And this is very important. It has I know sometimes it's hard, sometimes people are broken, some of the worst things possible happen. Life is not easy is really a real thing, and actually it's not just not easy, it's really terribly difficult and terribly hard. And I don't have to tell it to anyone, I guess, but there is always something you can do about it, even if ultimately things are not gonna work. And but at least you can measure your limits. You can also, in this sense, make better assessments. But most of the times, this is really what a successful life is based on. On failures that are overcome and become the spring for moving on. And this is really not just a simple phrase. This is really how it is, in my opinion. And I believe that historically speaking, this is very evident, especially also when you consider of the idea of progress. Progress came at a huge cost, objectively, and we're not here really to assess that cost. I mean, saying, okay, but how much? The important is what we have now and what we can do better now, because that's ultimately what humanity more or less tried to do. Even if, of course, there were certain anomalies, but we're kind of programmed for searching to better our own lives and to want to improve in a certain sense. So the theses are a very important part of your life. They're unique experiences. Many people think about them as obstacles, but they should really consider them as as a huge opportunity to shape their mind in a different way. And it's something I didn't say that I think, well, it's best suited, it's well suited for the end now, is that you realize how, I mean, at the beginning, especially when you go to university, you feel like you want to criticize everything. Then when you go on, it's as if that there is this fog of war that progressively vanishes, and you start seeing, especially looking back in perspective, that that system might have not been excessively good, but it still did produce some result. It still was good after all. And when you write this thesis, it's only at the end that you realize how important they were. It's as if there were certain stages in this process for which every stage is designed to make you obtain a certain result. It's not just something silly. And however, it's really you who has to give those results. We really has to make the thing have sense, because it's ultimately you who writes the thesis. It's not someone else. So it's you discovering it by yourself, and this is very important for for growing up, let's say, and to also understand how complicated really history is, because at the end of the day, that's what it is. It's I think the greatest difference. I'm not a great advocate for. I mean, I think everybody should study history and have a debate to discuss history. And I don't think properly that even having a degree in history or being a history professor, as I said before, is actually a precondition for for always being the most competent person in history. I met many people. There were exceptions indeed, and they were extraordinary in their own, in many ways, that were much better at history than many history professors without a degree in history. This is very rare. It usually happens with people who also have studied something in their lives in other disciplines. I know, as we were saying before, so many political scientists, economists, engineers that actually understand military history much better than many historians. That maybe study the same period, but maybe that they're not interested in military history and have difficulties because they've never properly seen it from a certain perspective. So it does happen, but in general, I think that the greatest difference between a person who has not, I can't even say studied history at university, but let's say having gone through that machine, that meat grinder, and a person who has got out of it is accomplished, getting it to the end, is really that the first person ignores the difficulty that it takes to make history. I mean, to research historically. So that other person knows that has made it through, knows how objectively hard it is to know history. That's why also the prevalent attitude of people who don't have time to study history, but study something else, they have another life, another profession, is getting to ask naturally about history to people, and sometimes not fully understanding the implications, and making it simpler, essentially having a simpler narrative that is maybe driven by maybe good, maybe even kind of rational, logical, you know, reflections and so on, but that never quite gets to the sometimes to the real point. And this is the point, and that's in part why we have been heading towards hyper specialization, because in part, in spite of how much you can dread this in a broader structural systemical dimension in the academy and so on, it's still something that is obviously necessary. We still need someone who is specifically expert about one topic, because otherwise everybody can come and just speculate about it. Maybe with hypotheses that are good, kind of make sense, but until you don't check the sources, you know what the problem is, you really don't know. And I must say that having arrived to this point, really what amazes me of history is how difficult it is to assess and how easy it is to rewrite in part. To really focusing on so many different problems, because at that point it's not even a matter of contents, it's not really a matter of the sources as such, but really the way you interpret them, the methodology, the method, and the way you look at the source. Because ultimately that's what we have realized. The most up-to-date historiographical conceptions are aimed at this point at saying, okay, but what we have said up to now is, of course, is very good, but did we get everything right when we were building this knowledge? Did we use kind of good methods, for instance? Are we sure that how we have framed the thing is? And objectively, historiography, if you're acquainted with it, and you have a general understanding of how historiography progressed from certain times, that it's constantly like this. That there is a constant criticism of what was said before, and that's why also you need, however, this point of reference to say, okay, we have arrived to this point, and now that we know, so we are also increasingly dependent, paradoxically, on what has been written before in terms of really know-how. And this is a bit complicated. I hope I didn't sound too confusing, but it's really very, very important to write a thesis, because it makes you really through so many questions that you have never posed yourself until you're not acquainted with the problems, with the sources, with how you have to handle them. And until you don't arrive there, you can give for granted so much that you basically miss the point of what the whole question is. So it's normal. It happens at all times. Today we talk about history, but this is something that happens with all the subjects in history, also in history, but generally speaking, in every other subject, any other field of research and so on. And it's really worth a shot. Even if you have the opportunity of writing a small thesis for one of your exams and so on, just take it, because even the only fact of writing something down is something that obliges you to reflect on what you're saying, and to adapt and to frame and to rephrase certain concepts, because this is also what a thesis teaches you to do, is to give an order to your thoughts, really, not to just wander, make your ideas flying in the air and more or less thinking about them, but not really having tested them on at the proof of facts, let's say, with the sources, with what you can derive from them. So writing down helps you to also be consistent with your own beliefs. History is also a matter of challenging your own prejudices, your misconceptions. It brings you automatically to correct so many things along the way that it's a mechanical process, really. It's not really that the main line changes it can, but it's something usually happens on the long run. But even rephrasing your own words is so useful, because you're saying, but I'm pretending here to, or at least I'm supposed to say something meaningful, historically speaking, something that happened in the past at the end of, because that's the point ultimately. And I'm basically playing with these words that if I change one, it's shifted, it changes the whole meaning. History and reality, let's say, is only one. And how do I at least tend to that one, and I don't head towards another direction? It's a hell of a problem. It's a hell of a problem, and do not think that history is, what is written is always. History as a story that you can't consult because it's dead. History can really be reformulated in so many ways. Um, at least at the top, because I know what you're thinking. Oh, this guy wants to change everything. No, actually, I hate. Actually, I'm very respectful towards also the older historiography, because I think that aside from the sheer work that some certain scholars did, in the past, in the 19th century, etc., compared to us, but individually, in spite of the ideologism and the biased perspectives and so on, it still came out with pretty good depictions of history and reality. In fact, at the end of the day, most of the works you quote also from, I don't know, medieval times and so on, things that have been written really in the 19th century, the early 20th century. I mean, those were those sources who already wrote down the essentials of what you need to know. Then, of course, research went on. There were new sources were discovered. There is a finer criticism and so on. But sometimes we miss those origins. But the point is exactly this: is that history is fluid in many ways. I mean, even certain generations tend to forget what other generations wrote. This is a problem now that we're getting, especially with that huge amount of bibliography and that problem I was posing before. Only for anographical reasons. You obviously have, certain works that your professors knew and you most likely want to know, maybe, even if you keep studying all your life, that you don't even know they existed. At that point, it's a different historical experience, let's say. So, at that point, we will have probably a branch of history that will deal with the rediscovery of such, say, forgotten work, that by rereading it you will say, after all, what that this person wrote years ago, it was overall right. There are so many interesting points that older sources make, and after all, when we're studying history, we're still studying historiography, we're still studying people who wrote in the past to make us know something, together of course with all the other sources were just accidental, but in general, after all, the problems we pose ourselves today are not that different from the ones that were posed 100, 1000, 2000 years ago. They were pretty similar in some ways, because ultimately we're still the same people. So re-looking at it, it's definitely a duty. There is a point also which you can't distinguish primary sources from historiography. Think about Herodotus or Thucydides. I mean, that's how it starts, and it's much more lifelike, human-like than you imagine. And that's what I think history teaches you to see, is that also looking at the source for what it was at the time. What mind there is, what is beautiful, especially when you study sources in a thesis like a master thesis, where you confrontate several different authors, for instance, in talking about the same topic, is looking at how they all had a different mindset, they all had a different interest, a different personality, if you want, from what we can grasp, of course, because there are certain new fields that are emerging now, like understanding the psychology of a character through his letters, for instance. Well, how can you do that, especially with certain codified sources? It's kind of naive to pretend, but still, reading different chronicles, it really tells you, look at this person, this person was curious about these things, or expresses this thing, and it's interesting, in fact, exactly when they're talking about the same thing, because you can spot the differences and how the importance that they give, and that's mind-opening. That's mind-opening, because you realize that we know objectively so few, and we know it through the perspective of someone else that told us sometimes something incredible, because, by the way, these were worlds that are radically, at least very different from our own, also, despite people were the same. So you're also having a kind of individual relation with these people, saying, but this people really lived through these things. I mean, sometimes you say, just imagine what it meant. Just imagine if this had been you, how these events could have marked you, for instance. It's a beautiful experience, and until you don't get to resources, that is something you go through necessarily writing a thesis. Um, you can't objectively fully assess, and this is also why quoting, interpreting is fundamental for every story, because it's not just being about being proper, about writing the comma in the right way. It's really about being thoughtful and mindful, because ultimately this is always a brilliant perspective you can spot, is you're essentially talking about people. You're talking about human beings, and just think about if someone from the future read something you've written and invented irrationally or emotionally what you have said, and didn't understand anything about what you have decided to leave out there for posterity. And that's kind of a problem, because you're dealing with humans there. So you also have a kind of responsibility. It's like an inquiry, a judiciary inquiry. You have to find out what happened. You have to find responsibilities. You have to understand what hell was happening there. And it's only after many years that you get into these things, and you can start only kind of grasping more or less what the real point really was. And it's difficult, and that's why we study history, and why we spend so many hours, in case you were just wondering, to explain these things, to try to figure out what it really was like. And it's very important, and in this sense very first of all misunderstood properly at a certain level, because there are people who despise history, say it's a loss of time, nobody cares. But at the same time, it's still also dramatically underestimated. I mean, sometimes even by the same historians. I mean, so people who get interested into history, history is, to me, is can't say just a moral duty. I mean, it's already a big thing, I know, but I mean, you can't pretend everybody should be learning history, but it's really, it should be a long-term process of learning. Because otherwise, if you stop at a certain point, it's as if you had given up the opportunity to understand more about our world, about our society, and how we work, and what we're capable of. Well, whatever. This is perhaps too. Okay, I think I will stop here. Sorry for today. I know that recently I have been talking. Yeah, I've made this kind of in theoretical topics, but I think they can be interesting overall, and it can be useful maybe for someone. And also in May now, I'll probably also spend a week somewhere, so I won't be posting. I will leave you these things to hear. Okay, and for now, I just hope that you enjoyed this video, and if you did, please share it. Otherwise, leave a like or subscribe to my channel if you're interested in my upcoming contents. And for now, I thank you heartily for listening to me. I wish you a nice time, and see you next time. Bye.